One sec. All right, you ready?
Yeah, 1 second. Let me just
Sure.
pull up this, just in case you want to talk about some of the trend stuff with the lines. Let me just pull these up so I don't say them wrong.
Okay.
All right, cool.
Ready? Sounds good. We will start. Now, all right. All right, welcome back to the Fantasy Labs podcast. This is your host, as always, Brian. I am joined today by a guest who is in the middle of kind of moving jobs. We kind of caught him as he's moved from RotoWorld over to DraftKings. It's Adam Levitan. How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm a man on the run right now.
I hear you. So how are things with the new job? Have you? I guess it was just last week, so I'm sure you're probably not fully adjusted.
Yeah, so I went up to the DraftKings offices earlier this week. Met everybody there, which was really cool. Saw their office, which I can confirm does have beer on tap in the office. So yeah, it was really cool, and they have really big plans, or I guess I should say now we have really big plans
Yeah.
for content going forward, where hopefully that a lot of people will want to come to DraftKings not only to play but also to read what me and other writers at DraftKings like. So yeah, it's definitely exciting, and they have so many resources there to kind of push us forward with our content. So it's definitely exciting.
Gotcha. So what are you going to be doing exactly? Still writing a ton, I assume?
Yeah, so I'm gonna be writing every day on DK Playbook. I'm gonna have news and notes. Kind of a lot of what I did was RotoWorld. With RotoWorld was about the news and kind of stemming off that. I'm gonna have news and notes up every morning or every night, I should say, before I go to bed about kind of how things are shaping up on the week from a news perspective. And then also I'm gonna have the leverage column that I did last year for another site. I'll have that up on DK Playbook on Fridays. I'm also going to work on some projections, and not results-oriented projections, but more touch projections and attempt projections, and rush projections, which people can kind of plug into their models, like models at Fantasy Labs that I know are kind of proliferating right now. And I'll also be posting my cash game lineup every Monday that I used over the weekend, so you guys can tear that apart and tell me how bad I did and how stupid my lineup was, or maybe sometimes my lineup will be really good and you can tell me how great the lineup was. But either way, I'm going to post my cash lineup, win or lose, and kind of analyze how I got to that point. I'm also starting a podcast with Peter Jennings, CSU Ram 88, and Al Zeidenfeld. We are going to be taping Thursday nights and kind of going through the slate game by game. And, that's definitely one of my favorite things I do all week for sure, because obviously Peter and Al are two of the biggest winners in all of DFS, and just getting to talk to them for an hour about what they like over the weekend is definitely a privilege for me, and helps me get some better ROI on my games. So yeah, a lot going on, but it's definitely exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't even know about the podcast. You had started that podcast with Evan Silva, and just got a couple episodes in, and I loved it. It was great. In DraftKings, I was like, oh man, that's gotta kind of suck that you got 2 episodes in and then couldn't podcast anymore. So it's awesome that you get to do that, especially with a guy like Peter.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, the thing with Evan's podcast, I've gotten so many requests since I left Roto World. Like, are you guys still continuing the other podcast? And obviously, we're not. But I think that this podcast is going to be almost as good or better I guess you guys can be the judge once it goes down. But yeah, we're competing now, Brian. Podcast versus podcast.
Ah, that's true. One of the things that you and Evan first talked about in one of your early podcasts was, hey, we're going to give you plays on the preseason. I think FanDuel was going to do it, and then they ended up not doing it, and then you kind of switched to DraftKings. But we haven't heard whether you're doing preseason DK. I assume you are.
Yeah, I put more time and effort into my preseason DraftKings lineups than I have anything in a long time, and I think the edge is just so massive. I don't think we find better spots all year. I mean, the amount of players that are either inactive or project to play 0 snaps or have already been ruled out that people roster is just out of control. Guys like Ray Rice I've seen in lineups, and I've seen Sean Green in lineups, and Pierre Thomas in lineups. I've seen Calvin Johnson and Adrian Peterson, just guys that are so obvious, Des Bryant, that they're not going to play. So even though I've definitely bricked out a lot, and I used guys like James O'Shaughnessy, like the backup tight end on the Chiefs, I used him in week 1, and he airballed for me, but it didn't really matter because every other lineup has so many airballs that I can kind of find my way to the money relatively easily. So I'm definitely putting a ton of effort into my preseason. Week 3 kind of sucks because even the people that play the starters have a positive expectation, but back to week 4, I can't wait for week 4 because that's when we can really shine with some of the second and third stringers.
So what is the breakdown as far as like this last upcoming 4th week of preseason? Is it like a half of starters and then half of second and third strings, or what's exactly the breakdown?
Yeah, so you're talking about the upcoming week 3. I consider this week 3, the second to last preseason game. Is that what you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah, and then the following week as well.
Yeah, so this week I think a lot of the starters play into the third quarter. So obviously, the starters produce more on a point per snap basis. So even if they're only going to play a half and the backups are going to play a half, you want to use the starters in that spot. So yeah, this week is definitely going to be about finding out which starters are playing and which ones you expect to play into the third quarter. I know last year, guy like Tom Brady played into the third quarter. I'm not sure he will this year, depending on the suspension. But I know a guy like Amir Abdullah, the Lions have already come out and said that he's going to play a lot in this game, and Joey Bell's not going to play a lot. We know Carolina's situation; they're super banged up at wide out. They're down to like Ted Ginn and guys like that, and Philly Brown are going to have to play into the third quarter for the Panthers, I think. And then for the last preseason game, week 4, which is just the Thursday before the regular season starts, I think it's pretty much all backups. And by that time, the first roster cut will have happened. So we'll have an even narrower pool to look at. So we won't have any starters, and the 4th stringers will have been cut. So we'll really just be looking at second and third stringers in the 4th preseason week.
Interesting. Yeah, that is. I haven't really got into the preseason. It seems like it's just a lot of following beat writers and kind of just picking up news blurbs. Is that mostly where you get your edge?
Yeah, that's my specialty, man. I go through and I read the papers. I try to read the papers from every city every morning and see what's going on. And then if you follow the beat writers pretty closely, they'll hint at who's been missing practice. I mean, obviously, if anybody who's remotely important to the team misses a practice ahead of a preseason game, they're not going to play. So you can kind of make some deductive reasoning with stuff like that. Yeah, it's a lot of work for sure, though.
Interesting. So talking about the preseason stuff, outside of just preseason DFS, just using the preseason to get an idea of how players are going to be, like your first stringers in the season. Sure. You see all these preseason games and you have a guy that goes off or does well, and everyone says, I know it's preseason, but running back whoever looked awfully great. Or I know it's only preseason, but man, that wide receiver looked quick, or he lost a couple of pounds. But it's always, we know it's preseason, but so say, okay, nothing in preseason really matters because, they're not playing against anyone, they're not playing hard, or, this matters, maybe running backs matter more. Like, where's the line in finding something actionable versus just noise?
Yeah, sure. And I think most of it is noise. There's 2 places that I think where it's not noise. Number 1 is usage. I love to look at who's playing with the first stringers and how much they're playing with the first stringers. Guys that we think are in position battles, or guys that we don't know how often X team is going to line up in a 3-wide set this year. So I think we've seen stuff like that. Like the Eagles this year have lined up in a three-wide set. I think Mike Clay from Pro Football Focus tweeted out today that the Eagles have lined up in a three-wide set on 94% of their preseason snaps. I think that's something that's actionable because I think it carries over to the regular season. I think we'll see a lot of Jordan Matthews, Riley Cooper, and Aguilar lineups, and we might see, hopefully we'll see some Aguilar, Josh Huff, Jordan Matthews lineups. But yeah, I think that, Jordan Matthews, based on the preseason, we can say that Jordan Matthews slot percentage is going to be way up off the 66 or whatever he was at last year. I think that kind of stuff is actionable. And the other thing I think is actionable is rookies, because we don't know, like, I see it in basketball too, like a guy can be great in college, but we don't know how his game translates to the NBA, and even vice versa. Like a guy can just be okay in college, and we have no idea how it's going to translate to the NBA or the NFL. And I think we've seen guys kind of blow up that maybe we didn't expect, and maybe not blow up, but play really well. Like I think Matt Jones on the Redskins has opened some eyes with how well he's played. I think Dorial Green-Beckham has been pretty impressive as a guy that's came in with a lot of hype and nobody knew he hadn't played football in so long, and he's looked really good. I think David Johnson is one that I'm really liked what I've seen from him. I know it was only one game, but I think that Andre Ellington, they see that Andre Ellington is going to be more of a change of pace back, and they want to kind of reduce his role and put him in the slot or put him on pass downs or kind of give him only 12 to 15 touches a game. And David Johnson, I think, is going to be a big part of the reason why. So I think rookies and stuff like that and usage are two things for sure that are actionable for the preseason.
Interesting. So like a situation like Doug Martin or Bishop Sankey, who looked really good running, that is just kind of noise to you?
Yeah. I mean, Doug Martin's had a lot of chances to perform well. I mean, he's been one of the worst running backs in the league from a metric standpoint over the last 2 years, both in terms of running and in pass protection. I'm still really worried about the Bucs offensive line. I'm not really changing my opinion on Doug Martin. I think that there'll be some traffic on him week one, though. I know he's playing Tennessee, and people are tweeting at me that they want to use Doug Martin week one. I'm not going to have a lot of exposure to him. And the Sankey thing, I would be more optimistic about, I guess, just because Sankey was a rookie last year, and maybe he's somewhat turning the corner. And I actually think that Tennessee's offensive line is somewhat talented if they can put it together. But that said, I think David Cobb is going to steal carries from him, and Sankey was just so bad last year, and the game script just gets away from the Titans so often that it would be hard for me to get really excited about Sankey.
So do you think that preseason stuff is useful in predicting ownership for that first week? Like, yeah, obviously you've said people have talked to you about wanting to use Sankey in that first. I assume they're talking on DraftKings or in the Millie Maker or something like that.
Yeah.
So do you think it's useful? Like, okay, well, that's going to bump Sankey up, and I don't necessarily believe in him, so that's an easy fade for me.
Sure. Yeah. Things have to hit like the mass public, I think, to really affect ownership. So like the Amir Abdullah thing definitely affects ownership. I mean, that was like crazy. I tweeted a Vine of Amir Abdullah's run, and it got like some insane amount of loops. Like everybody was like, oh my God, Amir Abdullah is the best. And which sucked because I think a lot of people that follow it closely, and I'm certainly no tape grinder, but everybody told me that Amir Abdullah was a really special back coming out of Nebraska, and that was kind of proven true. And obviously, it's in a really great spot with how Joyke Bell has been so banged up and ineffective. So yeah, that kind of sucked that Amir Abdullah went off, and his ownership percentage is going to be really high. I think throughout the first month of the season, just because people were so excited about that one run that he pulled in the preseason. I think guys like Doug Martin and Sankey will be bumped up a little bit in ownership percentage. I don't think it'll be a lot, but it's enough to make me think that they'll be over-owned. Yeah.
Gotcha. When you were talking about Sankey and the Titans, you mentioned game script, which is obviously an important thing for a running back, and kind of an important thing for all positions. I know with DFS boot camp and some other places, your specialty has been with Vegas lines and game script and stuff like that. Do you think that Vegas lines matter more for specific positions?
Sure. And there's a lot of data on this, and a lot of the data I got from Bales and Fantasy Labs. But like one of my favorite trends is favorite versus dog by position. So
Mm.
if you look at expected performance at quarterback, there's just a huge gap between the quarterback as a dog versus a favorite. You want your quarterback as a dog. They perform way above expectation as a dog. And obviously, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You know, a team is projected to come from behind, and PFF has a lot of good stats about how often teams throw when they're behind versus when they're ahead. Obviously, the league average is something like 20 points higher in terms of how often they throw when they're behind. So quarterbacks as dogs is a big one, and running backs as favorites is another big one. And obviously, that's the inverse of the quarterback one. It's just like if we can safely predict that a team is going to be ahead for most of the game, we know they're going to be running more often than they'll be throwing. And there's certain backs, obviously, that if we can predict the game script accurately, we know they'll be at a huge advantage. Guys like Marshawn Lynch and Chris Ivory and Alfred Morris and kind of those strict two-down backs that we think of that don't really play in the pass game. We really only want to use them when we are really sure that their team is going to be winning.
Interesting. Do you think for quarterbacks being better as dogs, do you think that extends to like your running quarterbacks as well, like Russell Wilson or Cam Newton? Do you think that they are also in that same boat, even though they may not throw as much, just because they're trying to run and get out of the pocket and extend plays?
Yeah, I think so. I think anytime you have more dropbacks, I know Russell Wilson, a lot of his yards came out of the read option, and I guess Cam Newton too. But anytime you have more dropbacks, you have more chances for a scramble. So yeah, I think as a dog is definitely the way to go for quarterback. You know, there's certain teams that throw relentlessly even when they're ahead. You can think of like the old Patriot teams that threw relentlessly when they were ahead, and I think the Colts last year threw a lot when they were ahead, and maybe that was just because they had such inept running games. But I think generally speaking, we want to lean towards quarterbacks as dogs.
Gotcha. So I had a question written down to ask you, and the question was, do Vegas lines have game script already built into them? But it sounds like the answer is yes, because as dogs, that means the game script is quarterbacks are going to be throwing more. Is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, people should try to understand if you're going to use Vegas lines, like you should understand where they come from, right? So like the sharpest books aren't in Vegas; they're actually offshore. They're at Pinnacle. And books like that take the biggest limits, and they have the sharpest bettors, and therefore they have the sharpest lines. And so they'll come up with kind of an algorithm that spits out a line, and they'll shade it. You know, they stick to their math says for an opening line, but they'll shade it a little ways based on where they think the action is going to come in. And then as the action comes in, they kind of move it at a half point or move it a point to kind of get action on the other side to balance themselves out a little bit. A lot of what we have to realize, though, is that these books are willing to make a bet. Like if their math says that the Patriots should be a 4-point favorite, but the public is just completely hammering the Patriots, and you would think they would move the line to 5 or 6. If their math is really strong and they really believe in it, they'll just leave the line at 4 and make a bit of a bet. And when they do that, the sharp guys often come in on the other side because their model is more akin to that bookmaker's model. So then the line stays, even though everybody, your mother, your grandmother, everybody on ESPN is picking the Patriots to cover. In fact, they're not moving the line. So I really like looking at stuff like that. In terms of his game script built in, sure. I mean, the lines are predictive of who is going to be ahead in the game and who is going to be behind. However, the odds are in our favor, but there's a lot of times when the game script doesn't go according to plan whatsoever. And I think that finding out when we can kind of pinpoint when those game scripts aren't going to go according to plan is pretty useful.
Interesting. So the main Vegas lines or important Vegas numbers, I guess, are, you have the money line, you have the spread, and you have the over under. Are any of those more important than the others for you, or are they kind of all equal things that you look at?
Yeah, I think looking at the spread in combination with the over/under to get team totals is a pretty step one.
Like implied points.
Yeah, implied points exactly
Sure.
is a beginner step one to Vegas lines. So
Yeah.
just because a game has an over/under 50, if a team is underdogs by 12 points, well, that's not a very high team total
Right.
for them. So I would say that's step one. The money lines I don't really look at too much, but I think line and total and in combination with each other are two important things to look at. And one thing that people actually ask me about all the time is player props. And while I do look at the player props on Sunday morning that come out, and by player props, I mean like a lot of offshore books, and Vegas also will come out with like over under on yards for Calvin Johnson or odds to score a touchdown for Jamal Charles. And while I look at those, the limits on those are relatively low. Like a lot of times in Vegas, they're 500 or 1,000, which sounds like a lot, but when you're taking $20,000 bets or $100,000 bets and you have a limit of 500 or 1,000 on those player props, you don't put that much effort into the line. I don't think they're nearly as sharp of a line as the spread and the total. So I think the player props are a piece of the puzzle, but a lot of people take them as gospel, and that's just not something that I do.
Yeah, that's a great point. So is there I guess a point at which like a spread, if it's too high, you would fade that game just because you're worried about, maybe a team pulling back at the end and not getting, all of the fourth quarter, or I don't know, maybe if an over-under is too low, will you fade a game, or do you have limits as far as, how you'll approach those?
Yeah, I don't think it's good to have limits, especially with the over-under, because so many people now, I think even beginners are looking at the over-under on games to when they're constructing DFS lineups, and a lot of people just throw out games that are maybe 44 and under on the total. So I think we can get a lot less traffic on those games. Yeah, in terms of spreads that are too big, I'm kind of a dog player. I always have this, there's always something in the back of my mind that says this game's going to stay close. This game's going to stay closer than people think. And that certainly bit me in the butt a lot before, and definitely in the NBA. We see that all the time. People are just deathly petrified of blowouts in the NBA because those guys are so prone to rest. But yeah, you can think about game script. I mean, when a line gets above 10, that's a really big line in the NFL. In fact, I don't even think there's a line above 10 in week 1. I could be wrong, but I don't think that there is. So more often than not in the NFL, these lines are going to be below 10, and I don't worry too much about the blowouts. I do think about how the game script is going to go, but I don't think that like people are going to rest or anything like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing that that Bales and I talked about on our podcast last week was just how tough it is to predict stuff in the NFL. Just like sample size issue. Like it's something, if a player had something that was a 16 game sample in Major League Baseball or NBA, we'd be like, wow, that's really small, when that is an entire season for NFL. So just the nature of there's less games means that it's kind of harder to predict. So do you think that Vegas lines are maybe, and you're an NBA guy, do you think they're less or maybe more volatile than they are in NBA?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the end of the year, almost every year, what percent of time the favorite covers and what percent of the time the dog covers, it comes out like 50-50 or like 52-48. Like, it's somewhat predictive in that sense that the favorite's going to cover half the time, the dog is going to cover half the time, but figuring out when that is really, really tough. And I know Bales talks a lot about capitalizing on that unpredictability. Everybody thinks that the team that's favored by 7 is going to win. Well, maybe not. And if they don't, there's going to be no traffic on that team that's an underdog by 7. So yeah, I think understanding how unpredictable and how small the sample sizes are is definitely huge.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, a lot of people use Vegas lines to say, okay, well, I'm using these Vegas lines to be on these teams, whereas we can almost look at it as I'm going to use Vegas lines to try to predict where people are going to be on, and then I can kind of veer off of those teams. So like you said, just the fact that it's not predictable, you might lean more towards dogs because you think that maybe it's more volatile, and you can, I guess, have an anti-fragile, as Bales would say it. So that's kind of how you approach it, just, setting yourself up.
Right. So the first thing I try to find each week is like, which side of the game on the week is the public just in love with? And what I mean by in love with, like, not who's going to win the game, but they think that X team is going to cover like 90% of the time, right? And if the line doesn't move, even though 90% of people think that the team is going to cover, I know that that Vegas or the really sharp guys or the really big bettors or the guys offshore, they think that the underdog is going to play well. So that's definitely one spot that I look at immediately, and I'm like, man, I want to get some exposure to this dog side. Because generally speaking, if 90% of people think a team is going to cover, they're usually wrong. And usually these are the people that, kind of are extreme recency bias. Like they saw X team play really well last week. They just they assume it's just going to continue. I love talking about, and I use this in my boot camp presentation. Like if you think that the Patriots are an 8 out of 10 overall, sometimes they're going to play 8 out of 10. Sometimes they're going to play 10 out of 10. Sometimes they're going to play 4 out of 10 in terms of their capabilities. And everybody else just assumes that they're always going to play 8 out of 10. It's like, oh, the Steelers are playing this, or the Patriots are playing this week. They're going to play at an 8 out of 10. Well, I think that we can find some spots where they're not going to play 8 out of 10 and fade them and get on the other side. So yeah, finding out where the public is at and assuming that the public is not too sharp when they're at 90% of the herd mentality on one side is definitely a huge thing for me.
Do you think have you heard of anything for week 1 where you're going to try to fade? I mean, I know the Philly game, Atlanta, those teams that have the high over under in their games are going to be the major one. Then you also have the Giants Cowboys. Are those ones that you might look to maybe fade in a tournament?
Yeah, it's just such a great spot in the Eagles Falcons game for sure. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really looked too hard at the consensus numbers yet. I assume there's going to be some really big public versus sharp money. Like the whole public is going to be on Seattle -3 at St. Louis, right? Like everybody's going to be on Seattle, and that's obviously a spot where St. Louis's defense could show up really well in their home opener and kind of shut down Marshawn Lynch and shut down Russell Wilson and guys like that. I think the Bengals at the Raiders is one, like everybody's going to be on the Bengals -3.5 at Oakland. Like if you ask your grandmother, who are you betting in Bengals versus Oakland? She's like, oh my God, it's a no brainer. Give me the Bengals. And that kind of stuff scares me when the line is only 3 and everybody thinks that the Bengals are going to cover really easily. So, the Eagles Falcons game and stuff like that, I know there's going to be a ton of traffic on it. I think it's great to fade that game in theory. It's just going to be really hard for me to completely fade it. I certainly won't be like stacking Mark Sanchez or Sam Bradford and Jordan Matthews and Julio Jones and expecting to win a tournament because everybody's going to have them. But I think for my cash games, at least, I would definitely be on games like that.
Yeah, that's a good point on the Raiders Bengals games. That was one I was going to ask you about specifically, actually, because I was looking at the lines and that one particularly stood out. It was Bengals. I saw it as 3. You said it was 3.5. So I mean, what do you do with lines like that? Because there's always a line every week that just makes no sense,
right?
And it's like, okay, is that Vegas telling us something, or is that an inefficiency that we can exploit?
Yeah, so you've already gotten to step 1, right? The line makes no sense. If you're able to look at a bunch of lines and say this line makes no sense and do that quickly, you're definitely ahead of the game. And yeah, when something makes no sense, I start looking to it further. And the more I look into it, I'm looking for reasons to fade the Bengals in this spot. Like, week 1 is kind of different because I think, everybody's emotionally up for week 1. Like the Bengals aren't going to go in there and not be ready to play. Because it's week 1, but if this was like week 7 or something like that, I would be like, they're going to go in there and lay an egg at Oakland. And does it happen every time? No, but it happens enough to the point where I don't really want to be on the Bengals, especially because we know they're going to have a ton of traffic on them in terms of ownership percentage. So we'll see exactly where it comes down in week 1, how many people are taking the Bengals if it's up above 80. And you can find this stuff on Sports Insights. You can find this stuff on covers.com. That's where I like to look for my consensus numbers. If you find it above 80 or 90% of people taking the Bengals, it'd be really, really scary for me to use very many Bengals, even though it's obviously a dream spot for Jeremy Hill and AJ Green and those guys.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Jeremy Hill because I paid $7,100, and it's got that. It has opponent rank when you select your players, and it's got that pretty green 30 second. And if you don't know, there's only 32 teams in the NFL. So you see them and okay, the Raiders are really bad. Obviously, that confirms because it says 32 and $7,100. Like, what's going on here? So we assume that Jeremy Hill is going to be probably the highest owned running back in GPPs. So that combined with the confusing line might put you off Jeremy Hill.
Oh yeah, I think if I was trying to win the Millionaire Maker, I would use 0 Jeremy Hill. And especially if the line, like one of the things I talk about a lot in my presentation, and I'll be coming out with a Roto Academy thing, is reverse line move, right? So it's one thing to look at a line and say, hey, this is really weird. The Bengals are only favored by 3 in Oakland, right? That's like the first thing. And the second
Mm-hmm.
step is everybody's betting on the Bengals, yet the line isn't moving. So that's kind of step 2. But what happens if the line moves towards Oakland? So let's say you wake up Wednesday of week 1 and all of a sudden the line is only Bengals -2. Well, that's freaking insane. You know what I mean? That's like we know everybody's taking the Bengals, but the line is moving towards the Raiders. And I call that a reverse line move. And that's something that, makes me just throw a huge red flag up to the point where I would use 0 Bengals in cash or GPP, because that means there's a lot of smart people, a lot of people that have the most amazing algorithms that win the most money, the 0.001% of sports bettors in the world. They like the Raiders to show up and play really well in this game. And if they play really well, I think it's safe to assume that Jeremy Hill isn't going to go off. So, using line moves like that, I think is a huge, huge edge that you can find to get away from the herd and find some confidence in fading these really highly owned guys.
Interesting. So sorry to keep hammering this one specific example, but it's just
No, I live for this. I mean, this is my whole thing. Al calls me Ace Rothstein because he makes fun of me when I talk about this stuff. I love it. Go ahead.
So in a situation like that, that is just really interesting, where all the public money would be on the Bengals, yet the line moves towards the Raiders.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make you move off the Bengals, but would that make you move on to the Raiders or just fade entirely?
Yeah, so no, I mean, I would want exposure to Raiders. It's just like you got to think about how would the Raiders beat the Bengals. I think they would slow the game down. It would be kind of dink and dunk with Carr and Amari Cooper, and they would try to control the clock and kind of keep the Bengals offense off the field. So I wouldn't want to go nuts with Raiders players. And a lot of times you see a reverse line move. It's like it's almost always a road favorite that's overestimated by the public going into a kind of a tough environment or an underrated team. So a lot of times these are defensive teams. Like I mentioned the Rams game, I could easily see a reverse line move in the Seattle St. Louis game, just because sharp guys are always on the Rams because they want to bet defense and they want to bet home teams. And obviously all the public's going to be on Seattle because they are the public team. I mean, everybody loves Russell Wilson and Marshawn Lynch. So I could definitely see a reverse line move there. I would not expect a reverse line move in Cincinnati, Oakland, just because it's hard to see even the sharp guys getting too far, putting too much money down on the Raiders.
So in a situation like that with the reverse line move towards the Raiders, would you also see a parallel sharp money line movement down on the over under or some other place?
Yeah, I haven't really looked at that at all, but I would assume that as the line gets smaller, I think there's just like a natural algorithm that the books use a lot that makes the over-under go down also. I do know that the over-under betting has exploded over the last 3, 4, 5 years. It used to be people only bet sides, but now, for what I understand, there's almost as much money bet on the over-under as there is on the sides, which is interesting. So, if we see line moves in the over-unders that maybe don't correlate with the spread, that's definitely something to look at as well.
Interesting. Why do you think that is, that it's become more popular to bet over-unders?
Yeah, I don't know. I just think betting in general has just hit the mainstream more. I mean, the ESPN is talking about betting more. They have a whole ESPN chalk section. They bring on Scooch on Sports Center. Scooch is the legendary bookmaker, one of the most famous bookmakers in Vegas. They bring him on to talk about lines every week, and I think that has a big effect. But yeah, I just think betting has become more mainstream and skill-based gaming, the poker boom and the daily fantasy boom, just skill-based gaming has obviously gotten really popular. And I think that has a lot to do with our generation also. I'm in my 30s and everybody I know and younger would rather, be dead than play roulette or pull a slot machine. I think we want skill-based gaming. And I think that betting on sports and playing daily fantasy and playing poker, I think that's all part of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Vegas lines is a good way to get an edge, especially if you're looking at kind of the smaller things that people won't look at, like reverse lines. Another thing you can do to get an edge, even if it's a small one, it's something where like a milli maker, where the room for error is so small. You have to almost hit a perfect lineup. You need even tiny edges. It is following beat writers and news blurbs, and this is your specialty.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to get into this just a little bit. So the first question would be, how much should we trust news blurbs? Like last year, we had the famous, we're going to run CJ Spiller into the ground. And that just like made everyone take CJ Spiller, in the first or second round, and his ownership was just crazy high. Where's the line to trust this stuff? And when is it just coach talk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of feel with it, and you should not be taking news blurbs at face value. You should be clicking on the link that they come from, and reading for yourself, and you decide if it's coach speak or not, or it's one more piece of the puzzle. I definitely don't take coaches, what they say as gospel whatsoever. And a lot of times maybe coaches aren't even trying to lie. Like maybe they just, like, ideally the Saints this year want to reduce the amount of points it takes for them to win a game. They've been very adamant about that. They want to reduce the number of attempts that Drew Brees throws each game. However, if their defense is atrocious and their run game is ineffective, we know that Drew Brees is going to be back there throwing the ball because that's what they know, and they know that can be effective. So I think even when coaches want to give a hint about what they're going to do, sometimes it just doesn't go that way for them, and that ends up screwing everybody up. The news blurb thing, like the beat writer observations, like Hakeem Nicks looks great in practice today. I don't put a lot of stock in that. I think I put a lot more stock in Ty Montgomery is running with the first team offense for majority of snaps today, and Jeff Janis hasn't gotten any first string snaps. I think that means something to me, and kind of finding those nuggets. And sometimes they're not even on Twitter. I think a lot of people just assume that at Roto World we got all the blurbs off Twitter. I kind of made it a point to try to go into articles and see if I can find stuff that isn't on Twitter, because obviously if it's not on Twitter, less people see it, and there's more value to our readers at Roto World. So yeah, the news thing, you got to be careful with that. I kind of felt like it was an art form a little bit to finding good ones and to finding when people are telling the truth and when they're lying. But for sure, we always think we know more than we know, and we're going to find out how truthful the coaches and the beat writers and everybody are being in a couple weeks here.
So the beat writer stuff, whoever wide receiver X has looked really great. It is less important. But a lot of that is kind of preseason stuff, as we're trying to gauge who's going to be the number one and who's going to get targets and stuff like that for week one. But as we get into the season, and let's say we're in week 7, so we're in the middle of the season, is there anything that we can find from beat writers that's going to be important for during the middle of the NFL season?
Yeah, mostly injury stuff. I mean, the NFL and DFS is so injury hinged, it's just crazy. If you knew that Brandon Marshall was going to be a decoy for a huge part of that game where he was last year, obviously that would have been a huge thing to know. And if you were a beat writer at practice and you saw him not practice at all or hobble around, that would be value, obviously. I remember last year, week 15, I was at the FFFC, and one guy used Jeremy Hill, and that guy ended up winning the entire tournament. He won $2 million. And he said that one of the reasons he used Jeremy Hill was because he saw a news blurb in which Hugh Jackson said, hey, I want to ride one running back this week. He was kind of rotating between Gio and Jeremy Hill. And he was like, enough of this. I want to ride one running back. I think that we need to get the guy lathered up. And if you went back and looked at kind of the tape and looked at the usage, it was pretty obvious that Jeremy Hill was the one that was playing far better. And Hugh Jackson was the one that was referring to Jeremy Hill. So I thought that was something that was useful. I didn't necessarily believe Hugh Jackson completely, but when he said something like that, I definitely would take note of that and try to get at least some exposure to Jeremy Hill. And only one guy out of 100 did it in the FFFC.
So that's actually kind of answers my next question, because I was going to ask, how visible are these news blurbs and beat writers? Because I guess I kind of assumed that the average DFS player was getting smarter. So it's like, because of sites like Roto World and now stuff that you're doing over at DraftKings with news blurbs and all this stuff, you would think that the edge is smaller just because everyone's hearing these, or but I guess
Yeah.
that's not true.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it felt like we had a huge impact at Roto World if we put
Yeah.
a news on headline. And I think,
Yeah.
some of that did affect ownership. I think Evan's column affected ownership a little bit, but maybe not to the scale that people think, just because, there's like 3
Mhm.
million people on DraftKings or something like that right now. I have no idea, but, I don't even know how many readers we had at Roto World, but it was nowhere near 3 million on a weekly basis, I would guess. So yeah, maybe, when you're in the bubble of on Twitter every day and reading Roto World every day, that you're not necessarily understanding what the masses are doing when they're making their lineup.
Hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. Cool. Sounds great. Well, we'll let you run. I appreciate you coming on. We can follow you at Adam Levitan on Twitter. Is that correct?
Yep,
Perfect. All right. Well,
exactly.
Adam, thanks. Perfect. Thanks for coming on. And have you started writing on DraftKings, or is it coming soon?
Yeah, no, it's coming. Yeah, if you follow
Okay.
me on Twitter, I'll be linking to all my stuff on there. But yep, it's coming.
Perfect. All right. Well, check that out. Adam, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you guys soon.
All right.